Hi there, and welcome back to Sci-Burst, a podcast about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We're your hosts, Isabel
and Ella, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds steering you on this spaceship into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode is queer representation in science fiction. Where is it?
Where is it?
No, for real. We are going to dive into why only recently we're starting to see representation in media of LGBTQIA plus people, but how the future is more positive than the past may suggest.
Yes, and as always, we're going to start by jumping into some recommendations. But before that, it's really important that we acknowledge this episode of Sci-Burst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Indigenous Australians are the first scientists and artists, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and future.
Well put, Isabel. I'd love to hear the culture snap you've brought in to share with us today and how it might relate to our acknowledgement of country.
It does. It relates to our acknowledgement of country and our theme for this episode.
That is a double bogey winner.
This is exciting. So there is a new AATSIS podcast, and for those who may not know what AATSIS is,
yeah, please let me know.
That is the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies.
Groovy.
So they've got a new podcast called Black in Books.
Black with a K.
Yes. So BLAK. There are 3 episodes. They're quite short. They're about 30 to 40 minutes long.
Ideal.
And it's hosted by an Aboriginal author, Lisa Fuller, who talks with award-winning First Nations Australian creatives all about the importance of representation and self-determination in fiction.
Oh my goodness, love.
Yeah, so the first episode is with a queer and non-binary Mununjali author.
Wow.
Yeah. Their name is Ellen Van Neerven, whose text Water I actually studied during my honours year. Super exciting.
The connections get deeper and deeper and better. I love.
Indeed. What's your culture snap, Ella?
Mine is actually also a podcast. I love how we both synced up in this episode. My podcast title that I'm recommending is Sounds Fake But Okay. It is A-Spec podcast, so the hosts are both on the asexual spectrum, and it talks about anything and everything that the host determine. Is so hosted by an asexual, a romantic, and a biromantic demisexual. So it's so cool to see that A-Spec rep, because I feel like that's one of the less mainstream identities that gets to be celebrated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fun weekly podcast where you get to listen to friends. I love the easy breezy vibes it has. And I really enjoyed that episode about taking up space and the celebration of that as A-Spec people. Yeah, it's so cool to see, I guess, like queer podcast representation, which is also something we may talk about later in the episode too.
Ooh, is it?
Spoilers.
Those are some good recommendations.
Yeah, I love this medium that we're a part of. It's so cool.
Yeah. Meta to be talking about podcasts within our own podcast.
Don't break my brain. We've got a whole episode to record, Isabel.
Let's jump into the content for today. Ella, do you want to introduce our topic for this episode?
Yes, and friends, I have maybe gone off a little bit with this intro.
Ella has a lot to say.
It might be the most I've ever written as part of like our script, or like the dot points we usually bounce off of. So I'm going to kind of give an intro into the history of queer representation in popular culture, and particularly in the science fiction genre. So like sci-fi is a genre that presents and explores situations of humanity and the other, quote unquote. Edward W. says for there to be an us, there must also be a not us, or an other. And this is really said to be true in all domains of science fiction. Therefore, it does make this a perfect place for representations of queerness, and a way to highlight and celebrate LGBTQIA plus people as part of the us group. especially easy to do when our humanity as people is contrasted with non-human aliens, for instance.
Good point.
Okay, so it sounds like they're a perfect pair, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just like thinking, Isabel. I know we've done a lot of thinking recently. Think of all the queer and LGBTQIA plus representation in popular culture. Doesn't even have to be in the niche of science fiction or even science adjacent media, just like mainstream media as a whole.
Mm.
Can you think of a lot of examples?
Nope.
Are they easy to think of?
Nope.
Yeah. So there are some historical reasons as to why this isn't as mainstream as I think we both feel it should be. Like, we picked this podcast title. We thought it was going to be super cool. We were like, yeah, we'll think of some more. And like a week went by and we were like, this is really tricky.
We low-key struggled.
And we were looking and thinking and talking to people and friends, and
I think
not a lot was coming up.
Well, a lot of queer characters in fiction are side characters as well. So they're not
the first instances
exactly.
you think of.
Yeah.
And this kind of makes sense historically. So historically, queer people haven't been the most welcome in spaces in general, but in media this extends to having rules against representation on screen. So the Motion Picture Production Code, which is colloquially known as the Hays Code, this is a set of rules from the 1930s that really shaped American filmmaking and also intersected with the whole of the golden era of Hollywood film.
I have not heard of this code before.
It was a really weird code. Not weird. It kind of made sense historically at the time of like the coming out of Prohibition and going into kind of like it led through McCarthyism and the communism scares and the lavender.
Yeah.
Scares in America. But this Hays Code impacted queer representation because it banned quote unquote perverse topics from being shown in any way. And at this point in time, unfortunately, homosexuality was considered a form of sexual perversion. Gross. I can't believe that happened, but it did. And that made it so that any representation of queer people had to be shown in subtext. Otherwise, the industry risks like banning certain things and the whole like industry crumbling from the inside out right as it was in its beginnings. So shows and movie runners and production teams were really, really scared of breaking this code. It was self-enforced and regulated.
They did it to themselves.
Yeah, but the fear was that if you didn't police it yourselves, they'd come down and like rip you apart from the inside out.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so representation of queer people had to be in subtext. And this is where we see the rise of queer coding, where characters are kind of given traits that shorthand them as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but in non-obvious ways, such that at the time only people within the community could understand the shorthand. And this was never, outright said in any form of media to prevent against reprimands. Unfortunately, this queer coding mostly happened in the negative light because this allowed characters to to fly under the radar most easily.
Yeah.
So the Hays Code centered around making sure that crime and immorality, which includes queerness, were not portrayed positively on screen.
Oh my God.
And this was so dominant. Like, I cannot explain how dominant this is for media as a whole, like the Hays Code. There is so much on it. It covers a lot of things other than queerness. But yeah, today we're kind of just talking about that. This is why we ended up with the archetype of the gay sissy or queer-coded villains and queer-coded non-human animated characters. So we see Ursula from The Little Mermaid. Her character design is based on the drag queen Divine.
I did not know this until last week when Ella brought this up and I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, and
interesting.
She's a villain. She's cool. But Little Mermaid was released in the 1990s. Like, this is long after the Hays Code, but this is kind of like an ongoing issue stemming from Hays Code. We also see Bugs Bunny, character from the 1940s, so during the prime of the Hays Code. He was able to dress in drag and also kiss another male character, the human Elmer Fudd, because Bugs Bunny is a non-human character.
Yeah.
So there are only like villains and non-humans, and yeah, anything in the derogatory can get away with it, which is not chill, right?
No.
Because much of this has continued to shape mainstream media. Queer coding becomes harmful stereotypes, becomes queer baiting, becomes poor representation.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're part of the queer community and all you see in terms of like representation on screen is, you know, your community being the butt of the joke or the villain or killed off within moments of confirming your queerness, hashtag kill your gays trope. This is really not good or not healthy representations of the self. And lots of people have grown up with them. And we know, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, what we see is really powerful.
Yeah. The power of pop culture.
Yeah. So it's super important that there is good queer representation on screen and in mainstream media and just in media in general. And luckily, though historically this has been really, really tricky, we have been seeing more of it recently.
Yes.
So that's kind of like the history dump.
Whoa. No, I am so glad you did that background research though. And we see the Hays Code has affected science fiction as well.
Absolutely.
Which is what we're going to be focusing on today, obviously, science-themed podcast. And when we were planning for this episode, the lists of examples of queer characters in science fiction or science-themed fiction was often texts I had never heard of, which is sad.
It's really sad. Like, it's so cool that there are some that exist.
Yeah. But it means it's still not quite mainstream.
Yeah, and it's still not maybe taken as seriously or promoted as well.
Yeah, which is again why part of the reason why it took us like longer than usual to plan an episode.
Yeah, and we're at the top of our game right now, I'd say, in terms of planning episodes. This is like our third episode recorded in 3 weeks. Like, Isabel and I are getting these out for you guys.
Yeah.
But yeah, this one was really tricky, and I think that's also why it's super important that we make it.
Totally. So should we jump into some queer characters in sci-fi?
Yeah, so we're actually going to start off with queer characters in science fiction podcasts.
Yeah.
And we're starting here because podcasts are an emerging form of media. Not to say that they're not the coolest, because they totally are, because, you know, we
have one.
We have them, we love them. Just that in terms of podcasts, like, they're not really mainstream. There's not a lot of regulation. Thank goodness Hays Code has never touched the world of podcasts. There's no legacy there.
Oh, good point.
Yeah. In podcasts also, there isn't like a huge force of major players. I think podcasts are indie enough that smaller ones and medium ones are kind of more within the same realm. Like, you don't have to come from a massive production company to be like a good podcast.
Yeah. Well, there's also not a lot of regulation in general for podcasts. Like, anybody can have one, which has like good things and bad things about it.
And some of the great things is because podcast itself is a niche.
Yeah.
It has lots and lots of spaces for other niches, and that's how people love them and connect them so much. But within the niches of podcasts, there is the world of narrative podcasts, which take a lot of planning, and it's verbal storytelling and audio storytelling in a really cool form. And this is where we see a really, really cool array of queer science fiction portrayals. Shout out to my lovely, lovely friend and housemate, Imi, who helped basically actually created this entire list for me so that we can chat about how cool it is to see this representation coming through in podcasts. So we see in Welcome to Night Vale this character called Carlos, who is a scientist who is canonically gay and also in a relationship.
Oh.
And Welcome
Double
to Night
thumbs
Vale. I know I said there weren't like a lot of huge podcasts, but Welcome to Night Vale, I think, is the one narrative podcast people have heard of, even if they haven't heard of that many narrative podcasts. Like, it's really big in internet culture. So it's super cool that, there's a queer character who's also a scientist, just like straight off the bat. Love that. In Ars Paradoxical, the protagonist of this show, so hype, and not a side character, the main character, the protagonist.
We love.
Sally Grissom is an asexual physicist.
Oh my gosh, another scientist.
Another scientist, another female, another queer woman in physics, which is also like quite a male-dominated area.
Yeah.
So it's super cool to see that. Another narrative podcast is Starship Iris. This is a sci-fi podcast. The protagonist in this one is a character called Violet Liu. She is a bisexual science officer.
Mm-hmm.
And within this too, we also see the character Arkady Patel, who is an asexual queer technical officer. Also in this narrative world. And we also see in the podcast The Bright Sessions, a scientist who works in archaeology, which I think is like really cool, linking back to our paleontology and archaeology Animal Crossing episode, and like fun dives into that. It's cool to see archaeology come back up.
Yeah.
This character Melanie Trent, who is a lesbian. So podcasts and narrative fiction are getting the sci-fi queer female science representation niche so incredibly well. This is so exciting.
Yeah, so this is not media that I consume, but it sounds like it's media that I should be consuming.
Yeah, this sounds like, of all the types of narratives I would like to consume the most, this seems to be hitting all of the bits that I would like to see at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is so cool to see, but again, this is like an emerging area. Like it is like a niche within a niche, which is like cool. But I'd love to see this more in the mainstream too.
Are all these the examples you gave from like the last 5 years?
Yeah,
older?
I'd say they're pretty recent. I think Welcome to Night Vale has existed for longer.
Okay.
But podcast itself is quite a new medium.
Mm.
So none of this was in place when the Hays Code happened. Like radio was, but that didn't have the same regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And radio, though like adjacent to podcasts, isn't quite podcasts.
Yeah, it's a bit different.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. Go off podcasts.
Go off podcasts. Jumping from there, I wanted to talk about how that we are starting to see queer representation in more mainstream media. And the first place I'd like to jump to is the beautiful, joyous animated world of Steven Universe.
Yeah. I haven't watched this, but I know that it's quite a well-known cartoon show.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of my friends in the queer community, this is like a real comfort show for them. I've seen, lots of it just like in and around. I've watched like a few episodes here and there. I didn't realize until researching it that Steven Universe was the first mainstream animated gay wedding.
Wow.
Yeah. Because for me, Steven Universe is quite a recent show, like in how I sort and quantify things. But yeah, it has a sapphic wedding, first animated wedding even before Arthur, which we grew up with.
Because Steven Universe is more recent than Arthur,
Yeah,
right?
way more recent. It's just Arthur's wedding queer scene didn't come until afterwards. The really cool thing about Steven Universe is the main character is kind of gender non-confirming in a way that this would have been difficult to produce the show with this character in the 1930s under the Hays Code, because the male character has powers of healing and protection that often are associated with femininity.
Yeah, okay.
Can like heal people with giving them little kisses.
Oh.
It's just so sweet. But I feel like it wouldn't have been accepted under kind of like all the conservative views of the Hays Code. So it's cool to see it out and about now. Steven Universe, while super cool and groundbreaking, it's light and bubbly. It's kind of for children up. Like it is child appropriate, but touches on a lot of big themes such as family and generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
it's really cool and groundbreaking, but it also is groundbreaking in another way, and that is it shows the costs of pushing queer stories. So its creator, Rebecca Sugar, she was working on Adventure Time and was trying to...
Oh, so same creator. Ah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, okay.
She was trying to push a queer storyline in that, a lesbian relationship.
Yeah.
They got finally, I think, put in the last episode. They like hold hands and walk into the
That's
light.
like an afterthought.
It's like an afterthought of the studio, and she was pushing really
Yeah.
hard in it, and she was like,
That's
"Ugh."
really sad.
Actually, I can't remember if Rebecca Sugar uses she or they. My apologies. But basically came from Adventure Time and was like, I'm going to create Steven Universe. It's going to be queer and it's going to be great. And we're going to have that as the plan from the get-go. So I shouldn't be facing much pushback. And unfortunately, there was pushback. And this time, it was kind of coming directly to Rebecca Sugar rather than like through corners, through like, oh no, I don't really think we can do this. Executive said no. This time, Rebecca was like hearing the no's and being like, is this what I've been dealing with? Is this what the industry's been dealing with? There are lots and lots of interviews you can go watch. Yeah, so even though in animation certain things are more accepted and are easier to push than in mainstream TV, there is still like a lot of more conservative thoughts.
And even now.
Yeah, even now. So reportedly, they had to sacrifice a whole season of this show. They had to say no to one whole season just to push the wedding plot
I
through.
can't believe that. How ridiculous is that?
That's crazy. And even though there's like all of this, like the show still prevailed. And like that is so, so cool. And
Yeah.
Artists and creators like Rebecca Sugar should be celebrated for being
Totally.
the first, pushing back against it and saying, okay, fine, we'll lose a season, but we keep the queer element. And that's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. So I want to talk about a TV show that's not a cartoon, live action, sci-fi.
Yes, getting more mainstream, I think.
Yeah.
Going from
Haven't-
podcast, animation, live action.
Yes. So haven't seen. Have you seen part of it?
I was watching the first few episodes of Supergirl.
Okay. Oh yes, it's Supergirl, by the way.
We're talking about Supergirl.
I should have mentioned that.
Yeah, I watched the first few episodes. I'm not a very TV person, but I was like, we have a female superhero and I want to support this, so they keep making more. So I would just put them on TV. Not even to watch them, just to like have another viewer being like listed as watching.
So Supergirl sci-fi TV show ran from 2015 to 2021.
Oh, I didn't realize they stopped.
Yeah.
Oh.
I don't know if there's going to be more seasons or not, but when I checked, the last episodes were 2021.
6 years is pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it follows the story of Superman's biological cousin, Kara,
Get
who
it?
is Supergirl, and her earthly adoptive sister, Alex Danvers, who they both team up to fight against extraterrestrial invaders. So superhero sci-fi.
Beautiful mishmashed.
Yeah. Also, the show exists in the Arrowverse, which means that it shares continuity with other sci-fi shows like Arrow and The Flash.
Nice.
And overall has optimistic storylines and vibes. Good
So
vibes.
important.
So I want to talk about the adoptive sister, Alex, who has a very positive queer storyline. Essentially shows the journey of a young gay woman who works in a male-dominated field.
Slay.
Fighting to save the world and overcoming the dead lesbian syndrome trend in popular fiction, which is what you touched on earlier with the kill your gays trope. Which is when lesbian characters are written off shows through violent death. Horrible.
Not a good trope.
Not a good time.
Can we stop it?
Yeah, please
Thanks.
stop. So at the end of season 1, she expresses her feelings for Maggie Sawyer, who's actually a female Latina police officer.
Ooh.
And comes out to her sister in a sincere heart-to-heart.
I
Which
love
we
that
love.
for season 1 too. That's
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and then from the reading I've done of it, apparently in season 2, she really like comes out of her shell as well, like after the coming out. So there's symbolism there. And many queer viewers have pointed out that Alex's coming out is very realistic in the portrayal. And unlike how it has been shown before in other mainstream LGBT plus inclusive TV stories. It's also been called one of the best shows representing LGBT plus in general to date by viewers, which might be because one of the show's creators is an openly gay woman.
I want to go back and watch this show.
So like I touched on earlier, some people found symbolism behind the reveal of her sexuality. Alex comes out of her sister Supergirl's shadow the moment she decides to come out as lesbian.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah. And also, she's not just a queer character in science-themed fiction, but she is a scientist.
Yes, let's go.
So she has a PhD in bioengineering, is an expert in alien physiology, and an accomplished neuroscientist and xenobiologist.
Ooh, xenobiologist. Really a little bit to last episode. Let's go.
So she can do all the things, apparently.
I want to be her.
Yes. I've also heard that the show is overall very inclusive because it has a mix of strong male and female characters of different races, ages, sexualities, plus creatures from other planets. And shows intersectionality through characters like Maggie Sawyer, who is one of the love interests, who is a lesbian Latina police officer. So
let's go. Aren't things better when they're diverse and nuanced and realistic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like when it's actually like real life.
Yeah. Rather than like, here is the one queer character we have over in this corner who gets to say 2 words and then we kill and put in a fridge. And we get to have, like one character of color, but they're over there. Don't worry about them. We're never going to bring them up again. Like it's nice when the characters are all together, friendly, complex, positively represented. Oh, go off, Supergirl.
Yeah. I know, it's clearly a show that I need to go consume.
Yeah.
I also don't think I've watched any of the Arrowverse stuff.
That could change.
So maybe I need to go watch all of it.
You could change that.
The other show that I want to talk about, which might be a little more mainstream, and I think more people would know because it's a Netflix show, is Sense8. Which is a sci-fi thriller where 8 strangers from all around the world discover a shared ability to connect with each other's thoughts, feelings, and actions, as well as an urgent need to find out how this happened and why. And then they pursue answers. And while they're doing that, a mysterious organization is hunting them down.
That's really rude.
Yeah. Not nice.
Yeah.
So, interestingly, this show is created by the Wachowski sisters, who you may have heard been referred to previously as the Wachowski brothers, the people who did The Matrix.
Oh, yeah.
And they both in recent years came out as trans women.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah.
Go them.
It's actually I haven't read much about their story, but one of the sisters came out, and then a few years later the other sister came out, which is
cool. Cool. And cool they get to go on that journey together, and they still get to work with each other.
Yeah.
And support, love.
So Sense8 has lots of queer characters who are also main characters.
Yes.
And in happy, supportive relationships.
Could we ask for more? Like, I know the bar was on the ground, but this is so good.
So one of them is Nomi, who's a trans woman and hacktivist, which they never really explain what that means, but something to do with hacking and activism. Living in San Francisco with her girlfriend, and Lito, who is a closeted Latino actor living with his boyfriend in Mexico City.
great intersectionality happening here too. Love, love, love.
So this show, like Supergirl, is also very inclusive and representative in general, although apparently a little bit stereotyped from what I've heard. Again, I haven't watched this show, so
let us know what you think.
But very much embraces the rainbow and normalizes queer sexualities better than many other shows. There are a lot of orgies in the show.
I didn't know what you were going to say then. Now I understand why you gave me that look. Okay.
But I think what it's trying to do is just normalize all the kinds of sexualities that are out there.
Yeah, and making them all equal on the same playing field.
Which is, I think, probably confronting to see it first if it's portrayed in that way. But then you probably just get over it.
Yeah. If it's positive, it's positive. Let's go.
Yeah. So I want to give an example of how it can work in the world of the connection. So a straight man can be connected to a gay man, and through that connection they can both feel what each other feels.
Like emotionally?
Yeah, emotionally, physically.
Oh, all the senses.
Everything.
Gotcha.
Which makes for some really good storytelling. And so in this scenario, the straight man can experience what it's like physically, emotionally to have a gay lover. So that leads to like deeper connections, better understanding of each other, and can better help each other because of that.
Yeah, it gives you, I guess, like a good shared point to jump off like your understanding of each other with, and give you like a starting place that is equal.
Yeah.
Nice.
So at the heart of the show is really a human story about the power of connecting on deep levels and the power of diversity in culture, gender, sexuality, and so on.
Okay, so I need to watch this one as well as Supergirl, as well as more Steven Universe, as well as listen to those narrative podcasts.
Yeah.
Isabel, please tell me that there isn't another great science fiction show you're about to talk about that I also haven't watched that I really should watch.
Well, the one you're going to talk about after this one is one that I probably should really watch as well and haven't.
But what are you going to talk about in between?
So I think it's always important to bring it back to the big sci-fi shows.
Because this is what's going to show us more where the mainstream consensus
because they're more established as well. So they can get away with doing things before other shows.
Yeah.
Not always, but
sometimes.
Which is sometimes. Cool. Yeah, so Doctor Who, everybody.
Doctor Who!
Here I am talking about Doctor Who again because I think I talked about it in the multiverses.
Yeah.
Can't believe I haven't talked about it since.
Welcome back. Welcome back to Doctor Who on Cyber.
So, I didn't know this, but the original showrunner of the modern Doctor Who series, so not the old stuff, but the reboot, whenever that started, early 2000s-ish, Russell T Davies, who's a leading British TV writer, is actually queer.
Oh.
Yeah. And known for TV dramas with gay and sex-related adult themes. For example, there's one called Queer as Folk.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, which there was an American version of a bit later on as well. So it was a popular show.
Go off, Russell T Davies. Okay,
I think it follows the stories of some gay men, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong because I have not seen. But yeah, there you go. So in recent years, Doctor Who has had like a lot of queer characters.
So good. So good to see.
Especially helpers and companions of the Doctor. The most recent one I can think of is Yaz, who was one of Jodie Whittaker's companions. And she is the Doctor's first lesbian Muslim companion. So again, some intersectionality.
Really going on there.
Yeah. The other one is Bill Potts, who was the Doctor's first black lesbian companion. And they actually her and the Doctor actually meet when Bill starts attending the Doctor's physics lectures as well, which is, I love that they meet in a science context.
So good.
Even
so
though
good.
Bill isn't a student herself, she's working in the canteen, I think, at the university. But like science, clearly.
Science bringing people together. Since
The one people may know who may not be as familiar with Doctor Who is Captain Jack Harkness.
queer fictional icon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And that the character's more explored in the Torchwood spin-off series.
Yeah.
But Captain Jack is omnisexual, which I hadn't
What's
heard
that as well?
until recently, which means no limits based on gender or species.
I mean, makes sense if you're into space, traveling, dimensional being yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also the first male character to kiss the Doctor.
Nice.
Yeah, so like I said, later he spun off into the more adult-oriented series Torchwood, where he actually leads an all-queer team against alien threats in the Doctor's absence.
I've actually seen a bit of Torchwood
Is it good?
because I heard it was queer, so I started watching it. It was good, but it's kind of scary, and I can't do scary very well.
Oh, no. Is it Star Trek a little scary there? I don't know. I haven't seen it.
I would say this is like more gritty and scary than the Star Trek that I've seen.
Okay.
But I've seen very little of Star Trek.
Mm.
Not for long though.
So the actor who portrays Captain Jack, I believe, is gay. And in an interview, he explains that he's bisexual, but in the realm of the show, we call him omnisexual because on the show, the characters also have sex with aliens who take human form and sex with male to male, women to women, and all sorts of combinations.
Cool.
There you
Thank you, John Barrowman.
go. And the other pair I can think of is Madame Vastra and Jenny Flint, who are very much lesbian Sherlock Holmes and John Watson.
That's the archetype and the characters they fit into.
Yeah, they're
Love.
depicted as female versions of Holmes and Watson. Madame Vastra is a Silurian, which is a lizard alien.
Oh, I've
species.
seen them. I've watched that. I've watched an episode with them in.
Yeah. Silurian detective in Victorian England and married to her human partner Jenny, who is also her assistant. Hence, Holmes and Watson.
The lizard alien species looks really cool.
Also, the Doctor
Yeah.
themselves.
Time Lord.
Yes. So now there are questions of, are Time Lords gender fluid? Because we've now seen the Doctor physically switch between being a man and a woman through regenerations and changing pronouns.
Yeah, alongside changing.
Yes, and we
Yeah.
also saw this beforehand with the Master, who is like one of the villains.
But cool to see
show.
it with like the positively presented main character.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, totally. And some have actually said that the concept of the Doctor's regeneration provides a useful analogy for gender transition.
Oh.
Yeah. And there's a transgender sci-fi author, Susan Jane Bigelow, who actually uses the post-regeneration episodes as a way of understanding her own gender transition.
Oh, that's so nice.
Which is beautiful. And I love
Yeah.
that Doctor Who can be that
for
for
people.
somebody.
Yeah.
And I guess when you think about it, it is quite, the regeneration episodes are very emotional.
Yeah, you're saying kind of like hello and goodbye to
Yeah.
all the storylines before, plus all the storylines to come, the
Mhm.
characters you know and love, their potential.
Mm-hmm. And Susan Jane Bigelow said, I've watched those scenes over and over. They matter to me, which I just wanted to
Aw.
include. I thought it was very sweet.
That is very sweet.
Yeah.
Also, with newer Doctor Who to be released, we see
Yeah.
transgender actress Yasmin Finney
Yeah.
being cast as one of the Doctor's latest companions.
That's right. And the next Doctor, Ncuti Gatwa, as well. That will be the first gay Doctor, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So cool to see. Let's go. Doctor Who proving, I think, more and more in recent years proving more and more accepting of queer realities and stories and celebrating those, which is really awesome to see.
Yes. Let's talk about another big sci-fi TV show.
I already dropped the name a little bit, but it is Star Trek.
Mm.
And we thought Star Trek was a great one to follow with because very, very from early days, so Star Trek's been going on since the 60s, and just like Doctor Who is a cornerstone of Western science fiction. And Star Trek, from the very early episodes, has portrayed this idea of infinite diversity in infinite combinations as kind of like a basis of Vulcan philosophy, who are, you know, these species and these characters are thought to be very, very logical. And this is what they base their philosophy off of, is infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Does that not sound like pure acceptance and a celebration of acceptance of all kinds, just, you know, not even just queer, but intersectional, everything?
Well, Star Trek has
Gorgeous.
always been very positive utopian view.
Yeah, and that's
So, makes
what
sense.
a lot of people love most about it. It's definitely something that draws me in time and time again. So I thought, yeah, let's talk a little bit about queerness in and around the beautiful world of Star Trek. Star Trek, very funnily, we almost made the whole episode this, but I think it's also like a story for another and a bigger time. But Star Trek is thought to be responsible for the first instances of the phenomena known as shipping. That is where fans kind of project a queer relationship, in this case between Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. So a gay relationship that is not canon. And this projection is kind of widespread, it's shared. It has potentially been the thing that kickstarted the idea of fandom. And like that is a whole story for a whole other time.
Yeah.
But it's cool that starts with, you know, this idea of a queer relationship.
Yeah.
Swapping to Star Trek actors, George Takei, who plays Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu in the original series, he came out as gay in 2005. So it's really cool to know that this series that have had a lot of associations with queerness, with representation, with people feeling comfortable, you know, has kind of been like taken care of by this gay man. Like he's, you know, made it a safe space for all this time and then felt comfortable enough to come out quite recently, but not recently enough that it still wasn't like a huge thing. Like 2005 is pretty early.
Yeah.
We also see this followed by, in 2011, Zachary Quinto, who he plays Spock in the recent kind of reboot of the old series in movies.
The movies with Chris Pine.
The movies with Chris Pine.
Yeah.
So he's, the Spock to Chris Pine's Kirk. He also comes out as gay in 2011. So we see, custodians of this story as part of the queer community openly, and that's really awesome.
Do you think it's something to do with the Spock character as well, and them feeling that?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the characters, because they're in the world of science fiction, like Spock is an other
Yes.
that is portrayed as having lots of humanness.
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at.
Yeah. And a lot of the early episodes center around like, can Vulcans who have interesting relationship with emotion, can they feel the same way humans can feel? And often like it's that the communication gets mistranslated, but yes, on the most important level, like he's exactly the same as any other crew aboard the ship and they can connect on that super important level, which is like a metaphor or symbolic, if you'd like to read it that way, of queerness. Yeah, it's so nice. Kind of like as a legacy from this, we see the more recent version of Lieutenant Sulu be the first main openly gay character in Star Trek. So in 2016, he briefly appeared on screen, but in a major Hollywood motion picture as being in a same-sex relationship with a man and raising a child, a daughter together.
Oh.
And that's part of kind of like a legacy of George Takei, who wasn't out when he was part of Star Trek.
Yeah, okay.
His next version of that character.
Right.
Then gets to have a queer storyline. Just like it's small, but it is there, and that matters. A non-small queer relationship in Star Trek is from the Discovery series. So in 2017, we are given Paul and Hugh. These are the first gay Star Trek characters on TV who are in a same-sex relationship and marriage. And they are
great.
played by queer actors.
Oh.
Which is even better. And these are both scientists. They do a lot in the medical world on board the Discovery. Yeah, Discovery, one of the more recent Star Trek TV series. It also gives us Jet, who is a female character in a same-sex relationship. It gives us Aderia, who is a non-binary character, who is in a relationship at a point with Gray, who is a transgender man. So lots of beautiful colouring to this queer world. We also see later in Star Trek Strange New Worlds a confirmation that Christine Chapel from the original series has dated a woman and doesn't need a label, and I really enjoy that too. We see this character, Captain Angel, played by Jessie Jam Keetle, who is a trans woman. This character, Captain Angel, is non-binary. And that episode that Captain Angel appears in is directed by Sydney Freeland, who is a transgender filmmaker.
Wow. Go Star Trek.
It's like Doctor Who, just getting better and better.
Oh, it feels like they're just getting warmed up.
And we're just getting started. And this is where we are in the world of mainstream popular culture.
Well, now, I mean, so I was already excited that Russell T Davies was coming back as a writer for Doctor Who because he hasn't been for a few years. But now I'm even more excited by the fact that it will probably mean there will be even more queer storylines.
So good.
Yeah.
It's so nice to see this happening in these beautiful fictional worlds.
Yes.
But also,
we're
now starting to see queer representation in the world of science academia.
Yeah. And science communication.
Science communication academia. It's so exciting.
So by the time this episode comes out, Queering Science Communication, Representations, Theory and Practice, a new academic book will be out.
And where is this book from, Isabel?
Australia.
We have Australian queer science communication academic book coming out. So exciting.
Including chapters co-written by some of our CPAS colleagues.
People that we know.
Yeah.
Oh, what a good world we live in.
So this is from the blurb.
Tell me.
This collection examines the place of queer people within science communication and asks what it means for the field to queer science communication practice, theory and research agendas. Written by leading names in the field, it offers concrete examples for academics, students and practitioners who strive to foster radical inclusivity and equity in science communication.
Yes.
And it also includes a chapter on queer characters in science-themed fiction.
If only we could have read that for this episode.
I know, which makes me upset that it wasn't out on time.
We'll just be around for part 2 when there's even more to talk about.
Yes. So the editors, Lindy Orthier and Tara Robertson, also wrote a journal article a couple years ago calling for queer world making and integrated intersectionality in science communication. Yes. And I wanted to read this wholesome and enlightening quote from the paper's conclusion.
Please do.
Here is something we each realized about science communication in the last few years. It can be something of a refuge for some queer people, especially those fleeing other STEM fields. Indeed, a science communication class was the first place where one of us comfortably outed ourselves in a professional context.
Oh, that's so special.
This is just another reason to like science communication.
I feel like I'm getting a hug, but like the hug is excited.
Yes.
That's like it's all bubbly.
Yes.
And I also saw right before we recorded this, the book is releasing in days.
As we're recording.
The authors themselves, I've just seen, have gotten their first copies of it.
Yes.
Like their hands on it. And this was reposted by an organization called Science Queers. And it just like came up on my LinkedIn. Science Queers is a place that represents LGBTQIA plus identities through science communication. They organize science shows and conferences to showcase the art and research of LGBTQIA plus people. And I've never heard of them before.
No.
And I'm so excited to see this in connection with this book. And that's another queer science communication entity. And I'm so excited. Like, how much more are we going to see in the coming days and weeks as this book comes out and people become more comfortable and academia itself gets to become more queer, and it's so exciting. We're like, right at the forefront, I'm ready to go.
I'm surprised I hadn't heard of this before.
Well, now you know.
Well,
now you've heard of it.
Now I do know.
How do we join?
Oh, what a great episode.
I feel so positive about the state of the world right now. I want to like climb a mountain. That's where I'm at.
You could go do that after we finish recording this episode, Ella. So we've talked a lot about queer representation in science fiction. I want to pivot to talking about queer representation in music as an interesting like compare and contrast.
Let's go. Isabel, hit up your individual section. I want to hear it. Tell me your theory.
So queer identities and representation have been, I think, very publicly visible in the music industry for quite some time as compared to STEM and science fiction. So you can probably think of 3 queer musicians relatively easily.
So easily.
And likely more than 3, like many more than 3.
We just listened to some before recording this podcast.
We actually did. But then I think it would be difficult to do for people in STEM.
Who are queer.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the 1970s and 80s usually comes to mind when we start thinking about the emergence of queer identities in music, probably because pop and rock had become more mainstream around then, and the sexual revolution began in the late 60s, and disco culture was also directly associated with pioneering black and queer musicians. Gender and sexual fluidity became very visible, and through artists like David Bowie and Prince. And the ambiguity of their sexuality made the community surrounding their music a safe space for queer people.
Yeah.
There are also arguments that rock and roll was actually invented by a queer black woman. Had not heard this before until I started researching queer representation in music. Her name is Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and artists like Little Richard and Bob Dylan mention her name in interviews over the years and talk about how they were inspired by her unique fusion of gospel-inspired rock with electric guitar.
I feel like I have heard her name before, so that's really, really cool to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even outside of the big names of pop and rock, an even larger queer community existed in disco, electronic, and dance music, which was the types of music played at underground queer clubs. And I want to bring all this back to the idea that is queer representation in STEM and science fiction currently approaching where it was in music in the 1970s and 80s.
So is art that ahead, but science is coming?
Yeah.
Coming
Are
up.
we like, is it like catching up now?
That's a really cool thought, and I like that a lot, and I want to believe it. I really
So do
want
I.
to believe
I
it.
want to too.
You know what else I want to believe? I want to believe that I have more to say about X-Men.
I don't think you're ever going to run out at this point. Like, you are still going strong, Ella.
X-Men, as I've said a few times, Isabel, it has always been a really great vehicle for creators, artists, and fans to, once again, human the usual other through depictions of mutants. X-Men is the struggle for social justice cartoonified in the comics. Also, we see the start of this in cinematic depictions through everyone's favorite X-Men movie, X-Men First Class.
Everyone's favorite or your favorite, Ella?
Is not the same. No, I'm kidding. Please have your own opinions. The world is more interesting that way. X-Men First Class doesn't have any explicit queer representation, which is devastating, but also, as we can see historically, unfortunately understandable with Hollywood. It does have Mystique's kind of like gender transformations as she takes on the bodies of other people.
Yeah.
Also throughout the series, but she does, take on the body of a man. In X-Men First Class, is this gender fluidity? Is this just who she is? It's not explicitly explained, but it doesn't have to be. And I like that even that little bit, it's not representation, but it can make people more comfortable with the idea of like, gender visualization and presentation. And that's all through her mutation and her power. The film doesn't have any explicit queer representation. Sad. The comics of X-Men, however, do.
Oh.
And I've got a short list for us to just like speed through here so we can all feel happy and that like there is more than one. And I also want to acknowledge that this list is getting bigger and more beautiful and more diverse every day because comics are still coming out and characters are still also coming out. That wasn't planned. I am exceedingly happy with it though.
Love the pun.
So the first ever queer X-Men who we see canonized as queer is North Star, coming out in 1992 as gay. Pretty cool. We also see Shatterstar and Richter, the first two mainstream male superheroes to kiss in Marvel Comics.
Oh. And it was in X-Men.
It's in X-Men.
There you go.
There we go. Kind of like one of the most popular queer X-Men is Bobby Drake, who is Iceman. He has been hinted at being gay since the 1980s and officially came out or was declared as gay in 2014. So cool to see that coming through as society accepts rather than tolerates queerness.
Yeah.
So we can, have that representation. Mystique, who is in X-Men First Class, she's recently been canonized in the comics as bisexual. Her life partner / wife, Destiny, who is a lesbian, has been by her side since the 1970s. So, I guess legacy of queer coding to queer representation. Cool to see in these comics. Karma of the New Mutants, she's a lesbian. Wolverine's son, Dakin, is bisexual.
Oh.
We have a character, Kitty Pryde. She is bisexual, also confirmed in canon. Last year, X-Men debuted Escapade as a new trans character, so the first trans character we see in the X-Men comics.
Cool.
And maybe one of the most prominent ones of this list, Deadpool, who recently has had those movies with Ryan Reynolds, is in the comics pansexual.
Yeah, I didn't know this.
And Ryan Reynolds, as an actor, has been pushing for this representation in the movies, and it isn't not explicit in Deadpool 1 and 2. But in Deadpool 2, we see the first confirmed queer superhero in Hollywood film, in Marvel Cinematic Universe. It is not Deadpool, it is Negasonic Teenage Warhead, who is in a queer relationship with Yukio. So we see a beautiful sapphic relationship on screen. It's the first.
Wow.
Devastating,
For
but
mainstream.
beautiful.
For mainstream superhero. Damn. Why did it take them so long? Jeez.
I don't know, but you know what? Now that we've got one, let's not stop there. Let's keep going. I thought that was a really cool one to end on. Because, mainstream movies, I think, are like a saturation point for popular culture. And if we can start seeing it in mainstream blockbusters, we can start seeing it everywhere else too.
Yeah.
So that's all from us in this gorgeous rainbow episode. Thanks for listening. We have a few questions for you. And we would really, really like to know what queer characters in science-themed fiction or science fiction itself have you come across? Because we'd love to know more.
Yeah, because like we said, we were struggling to come up with examples. So
We'd like to build a list so big that almost like every podcast we have to talk about something queer, because that's where popular culture is at. I feel like
well, it's sort
that's
of like
an eventual goal for me.
we try to bring up something Australian every episode as well. Just sometimes it's really difficult to do.
But the more this gets out there and the bigger and better and brighter the world becomes, the easier it is to do.
Yes.
So please help us with this journey of understanding how bright and beautiful the world is.
Yes. Let us know your thoughts on our socials at sci_burst on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn.
All the good places.
Stay nerdy.
Stay nerdy, friends.
And we'll see you next time.
Happy Pride.
Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.